Hello biologists. We are working our way through the animal kingdom. We are currently discussing the invertebrates, and more specifically the Ecdysozoans, which are animals that do something called ecdysis, or molting, that external cuticle that they have. We are going to talk about arthropods in this video, which belong to the phylum Arthropoda or Arthropoda. It's estimated there are 10 to the 18th arthropods living on Earth. If you counted every single little insect, every single crustacean, every single spider and tick, our horseshoe crabs, these are all types of arthropods. So that is a 1 with 18 zeros after that. That's a really, really big number. All of those arthropods fit into over 1 million different described species. We have a really big diversity within this phylum. 2/3 of all the species that we know, in fact, are members of arthropods. This may change as we start discovering new types of species. There are some forecasts that we may end up with more members of certain of our worm phyla as we start discovering more organisms. But currently, 2/3 of the animal species that we know are arthropods, and they're found in nearly all habitats of the biosphere. We're going to talk about some that live on land, some that live in the water. We'll talk about some that can live in the air, some that swim, some that burrow in the ground, some that live on top of the ground. Anywhere that an animal can live, there is likely to be an arthropod in that environment. Within our arthropods, they have segmentation of their body. And you likely in elementary school drew those different segments of body parts of an ant or a butterfly or something. So they have these different body regions. And these different regions, today, they're specialized. They've been taken into adaptations used for feeding, used for walking, used for swimming. But originally, those segments probably came around by Hox genes. So there may have been changes in the sequence of the Hox genes, just some random mutation that was picked up, or a change in the regulation of those Hox genes, which allowed body plans to develop a little bit differently. If you recall, Hox genes are genes which do not actually make those proteins for your cells and your body parts, but they regulate those genes. So they decide where things are turned on, which can control very quickly. In a small change of your Hox genes, you can have very big changes in the different body segmentation and development of an animal. Arthropods include appendages. Those appendages are used to walk, they're used to feed, they're used for sensory reception, they're used for reproduction, they're used for defense. It may be things like claws, legs, antennae, these different types of appendages. And the name arthropod means jointed legs. So their appendages are jointed and in pairs. So we'll talk about their legs or their claws as being paired appendages. There are different body segments. They have a head, a thorax, and a tail, or an abdomen. Okay, head, thorax, abdomen. Sometimes you'll see the head and thorax fused together, especially in some of our arachnids. That head and thorax have been fused, and that then is called a cephalothorax. Cephalo meaning your head, and thorax meaning the thorax. They do have a cuticle, and the cuticle does have to molt, hence their inclusion within the clade of the Ecdysozoans. Their cuticle is made of a protein and a polysaccharide. That polysaccharide is chitin. You may remember that from our discussion of fungal cell walls. Chitin is very strong and gives it this very strong polysaccharide protein cuticle, almost like a shell. And by having this exoskeleton, that allowed them to leave the water back in their evolutionary history, where most animals were living, being able to leave the water, colonize land, which then gave them a new area without as much competition, where they could develop and thrive in various different habitats. The reason that exoskeleton was so important in their movement onto land, one is it's pretty impermeable. Because it's impermeable to water, the animal doesn't have to constantly be in water to stop from drying out. It can move onto the land and it's not going to desiccate or dry out because that shell is holding its body water within its body. It also is strong. It offers it some strength. So it's not just reliant on being buoyant in the water, but it also gives some support once it's on land. If you've ever been in the water, like floating in the water, you might notice it doesn't take a lot of effort to just like be there in the water. That water pressure keeps you supported in a way that the air doesn't. So without that water support, that water buoyancy, their exoskeleton instead was providing that strength and support. So those allowed our arthropods to colonize land and diversify into all of the arthropods that we see today. So you should be able to describe those adaptations that let insects thrive on land, what we were just talking about. There are three main lineages. This is based on both molecular evidence, so comparing DNA, comparing genes, comparing mitochondrial genes, and also morphological evidence, so their shapes, their body plans. And these three different lineages diverged very early in the phylum's evolution. So we see very different body plans in these three different types of clades. We have the Chelicerates, the Myriapods, and the Pancrustaceans. The Chelicerates include sea spiders, horseshoe crabs, scorpions, ticks, mites, spiders. Our traditional arachnids with the 8 legs are all within this clade. Then the Myriapods. So as that name sounds, they have lots of legs, lots of feet. We have the centipedes and the millipedes. Then the Pancrustaceans, as that name implies, we have the crustaceans, lobsters, crabs, all those yummy kind of seafood animals. Also within the Pancrustaceans, we have the insects. What's interesting here is that a lot of crustaceans are more closely related to insects than they are to other crustaceans. So that may not seem so intuitive that insects and crustaceans are very closely related, but they are in this same lineage here. So first, our clade Chelicerata, or the Chelicerates. They're named for this little claw-like appendages that they have, the chelicerae. So these little appendages are claw-like. They're used for feeding. Mostly they live on land. The marine ones have mostly gone extinct, except for our horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs are the extant or not extinct species we have within this clade. Mostly our modern chelicerates are going to be our arachnids, things with 8 legs. So our scorpions, our ticks, our mites, and our spiders. Oh, this beautiful orb spider. Next we have the Myriapods, which have many legs. So these are our millipedes and our centipedes. These animals are going to be terrestrial. They are found on land. They do have a pair of antennae and 3 pairs of appendages that are modified into their mouth parts, what they use for eating. They mainly eat decaying leaves and plant matter. They're not coming around trying to bite you and like eat animal things. And although they are non-venomous, they do contain poisons or irritants. So if someone were to try to eat them, or a bird was to try to eat them, it could be irritating or poisonous to that animal that's trying to eat them. The difference between a millipede and a centipede, if you stop and look at each little body segment, it's a little bit easier on the centipede. You can see each little body segment. On a centipede, there's 1 pair of legs for each segment. So this segment has 2 legs, this segment has 2 legs, this segment has 2 legs. 1 pair of legs for each segment. On a millipede, there's 2 pairs of legs for each segment of its body. Okay, so the difference is not 100 legs or 1,000 legs, like its name says. It's how many legs per segment. Centipedes have 1 pair of legs per segment, and millipedes have 2 pairs of legs for each segment. And here in this centipede, you also can see these poison claws at the front that can help aid in its defense. have our Pancrustaceans. These are the insects and the crustaceans. So here you can see this group of crustaceans, these Myriapods. They are more closely related to insects. You only have to go back this far to see how closely they're related to insects, compared to other crustaceans where you would have to go back this far. So some of these crustaceans are more insect-like than they are like their lobster relatives. And here our insects are more closely related, the insects and the crustaceans more closely related to each other than they are to Myriapods or definitely to our Chelicerates. So here's some videos. This is a lobster. It's different appendages used in used in feeding. This video does not have sound, so if you are trying to hear something, it doesn't have sound on it. Okay, then our crustaceans, as we're discussing. Crustaceans are the crabs, lobsters, shrimp, barnacles, those kinds of animals that live in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial environments. You can find them in saltwater, freshwater, and on land. They have very specialized appendages. Some of the smaller ones may exchange gases straight through that cuticle. Their carbon dioxide and oxygen go straight through the cuticle, although larger crustaceans are likely to have gills, like you see. And while many of these move, you may have seen a crab or a lobster walking. Barnacles are a member of the crustacean group that are mostly sessile. So their cuticle has hardened into a shell and they are held in place. Our insects, the name hexapod refers to animals with 6 legs. Our insects and insect relatives. They live on almost all terrestrial habitats and in freshwater, insects in the air, but they're rare in marine habitats or salty water like the ocean habitats. They do have complex internal organ systems. We're not going into all of these different organs that they have at this point. We will come back and talk about some of their circulatory and respiratory adaptations when we talk about those body systems. But they do have 3 main body segments: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. So here's a video of a bee pollinating a flower. One thing about insects and their pollination that they perform, so plants are reliant on the insect, insects are reliant on the plant. So the plant is succeeding in this relationship because its pollen is being transferred, so it's reproducing. The bee is benefiting from this relationship because it's getting food for it. So we see a lot of insects and flowers have co-evolved together, and their body plans of the insect and the body shape of a flower fit together very nicely to allow this pollination to occur very efficiently. Visits one flower, picks up pollen, goes to another flower, picks up pollen, but in that process, it's also dropping some of the pollen from the first animal, from the first flower. Insects do go through metamorphosis. We discussed this in more detail in chapter 32, so please go back and refer to that if you need more. But there is incomplete metamorphosis and complete metamorphosis. And in incomplete metamorphosis, you have young nymphs, and those nymphs, as juveniles, they already resemble the adults. So something like a baby cricket looks like an adult cricket. The insect will go through a series of molts as it is shedding its cuticle until it reaches its full size. And at its final molt, it may develop wings, it will mature sexually. Complete metamorphosis has a larval stage that looks very different from the adult. Like in this butterfly lifespan, this larva or caterpillar looks very different from the adult. And it goes through a metamorphosis where its body shape is going to change into its adult form. That happens during a pupal stage. So P-U-P-A-L, pupal stage, is when that metamorphosis from the caterpillar to the adult insect occurs. Here's a butterfly emerging.
This time-lapse movie shows the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a monarch butterfly. The caterpillar is the feeding larval stage and spends its time eating and growing, molting as it grows. After it molts several times, the larva develops into a pupa. Pockets of previously inactive cells in the pupa now begin dividing and differentiating into adult structures, while the larval structures and tissues are broken down. The most obvious adult structures are the wings, with their distinctive pattern, which you can see through the increasingly transparent pupal cuticle. Finally, the adult emerges, and fluid is pumped into the wing veins, allowing them to support the wings. The adult will fly off to carry out the functions for which it is specialized: dispersal and reproduction. The adult stage derives much of its nourishment from the calories eaten and stored by the feeding larval stage. Credit National Geographic.
So, which phylum is characterized by animals that have a segmented body? I'll give you a clue. The question is showing up here because it's what we've been talking about. Okay, so we have come through, we've discussed a lot of our different phyla of our invertebrates. We still have a few more to go, so make sure we finish up with our echinoderms. And I will see you later. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.